Okay, hello again. In this recording, I'm going to go back to argument as a means of increase. I'm going to discuss this point again, something that you are familiar with already at this point. So first is I want to go back to the point of using argument in this way. And as I said, argument does not mean verbal or actual fist fight. And argument means having a set of sentences where one of them is a conclusion and all the others are premises or evidence for that conclusion. So what's the point in engaging in argument? In a book called The Craft of Argument, Williams and Column say arguments sustain communities and enable democracy. Now, some people who dislike confrontation and who think that arguments are noisy quarrels may be puzzled with the view that arguments sustain communities. But here's the thing, in any community, even in like a family unit or a household, or a student organization or a country, there will never be 5 people, 50 people, or 5 million people who think in exactly the same way. There are going to be differences of opinion. Now, for a family unit or a community to remain intact and to have some kind of stability and harmony, even if there are differences of opinion. Argument is a method of working through differences of opinion, even if after engaging in argument, you don't exactly think the same way, because actually we don't want to have people thinking in exactly the same way, but we want them to be thinking differently in a way that is democratic, meaning to say open to discussion and open to consensus. So although reason constitutes the core of argument, sometimes people think of argument as strictly logical, kind of like the proofs in mathematics or geometry, or the kind of thing the logicians do, like premise one, premise two, premise three, like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, is a classic example. Um, it's raining. If it is raining, the streets are wet. Therefore, the streets are wet is another classical example. That is, and those are arguments that are purely on the basis of reason. When we are in the domain of ethics, we cannot have something that is purely in the domain of reason. So when we argue, it's not entirely separate from other acceptable modes of persuasion. Sometimes this is called rhetoric or good polemic strategy, like how you organize the reasons, what you present first, how you concede the point, how you recognize a valid point of your opponents, but then show that even if their point is valid, still there's reason to not accept their conclusion. These are all tactics, right? It's called a polemic strategy. So this is very important because as we argue, there is also an element of negotiation in this. When we engage in argument, we take responsibility for what we say or what we believe. So this again goes to the point of we don't want bare assertions, meaning unsupported claims, and you just bang on the table or you just wave your hands and say, this is right. Okay. We want to be able to present a list of assembled reasons and evidence so that people can make up their own minds. So when we make a claim, especially a controversial one, we are required to A, support it well, so provide reasons and evidence, and B, fairly recognize opposition to it. A very, very important element of arguing is considering objections, being open to objections in the sense of being willing to discuss them and being willing to recognize that no matter how well assembled your argument is, there are weak points to it, and you are willing to work more on those weak points, and you are also willing to listen to a different point of view. So this means being open to challenge, meaning open to questions, objections, etc. Okay, so this is very important as we prepare to argue about a moral issue, a case, as we prepare to argue about the decision about the case using the framework of rule utilitarianism. Okay. So what are the things that you can do when you engage in argument on the topic of martial law or some other case? When you argue, one of the things is that you can raise objections, right? I was just saying that, right? So actually, philosophers and other academics are very well trained in this. You give them a set of sentences, a book, or a journal article establishing a certain conclusion. They're very good at raising objections, right? This is one of the things you can do in argument, but it's usually not a good idea to begin with this, right? Thinking of counterexamples is another thing. When people generalize about the rightness or wrongness of something based on consequences, you can think of a counterexample. The act utilitarian Frenchman, if you remember that, is a good counterexample. So that was concocted, that was created to show that there's a problem with act utilitarianism. So you can detect logical fallacies or reject conclusions based on them. So arguments based on appeals to pity, arguments that are ad hominem, that are attacking the person instead of the premises presented, instead of the reasons and evidence presented. I am sure that you heard about logical fallacies before and you have studied them in senior high or even before that. You can examine premises and hidden assumptions. This is actually one of the areas where philosophical reflection can help a lot. What are you assuming when you say that we cannot judge practices of other cultures? Right? That's a good example of how Midgley was trying to expose certain assumptions and hidden premises. Or what's the world picture behind this that you seem to be assuming, but you're not defending why we should see the world in this way. The other is to compare different paths of reasoning that arrive at similar conclusions. An example that we've seen is Peter Singer's argument for changing the way we see charity, and Thomas Aquinas' argument for how we should see resources as not belonging to us when other people need it more, right? So one simple strategy that you can use, apart from this list that I just presented, is if there are two views on something, you can take each one in turn and examine all the reasons for or against. So you can create a table. What are the advantages to this view? What are the disadvantages to this view, right? So thinking that martial law and historical revisionism are wrong because of bad consequences. Okay. When you think that, what are the advantages to it? What are the good reasons that you can give for it? What are the disadvantages? What are the challenges? And then after you do that, you set it aside and you do the other view, right? So that way you can have a weighing of pros and cons and a more deliberate way of analyzing like the different views. And this is actually very helpful if you have, sorry, that was my alarm. I'm not sure if you heard that, but anyway, so if you have a very strong intuition for or against a certain view, like if you hear that martial law and historical revisionism are wrong only because it yielded bad consequences, and you don't want that, right? It's a good idea to do the pros and cons of the other view so that you don't get blindsided to a different perspective, right? So what we're trying to do is we're applying a framework for ethical decision making. I have this framework in the course guide. It's the last page of the course guide. We're not applying the full framework yet. We're beginning to apply part of it. So in module 4, I start to introduce this to you, and I'll talk more about it afterwards, and we'll continue along the framework even after the midterms. And also, we are trying to engage in argument by following this guide. So I'm going to talk about a guide for successful critical commentary developed by a philosopher called Daniel Dennett. So here's the guide. Daniel Dennett, I'm sorry to say, gave a good guide for successful critical commentary that he doesn't always follow. But I think it's a good guide to consider, right? So first, first, even before you go to number one, right? Even before number one, you should identify who your target is. Who or what is the view that you are against? So remember Midgley arguing for a certain definition, for a certain conception of moral judgment. She created the target. The target is moral isolationism. So when you argue, when you use argument, you should be very clear about what the target is. What is the view that's different from yours, right? Now, once you have identified it, then you can start with one. You should attempt to re-express your target's position so clearly, vividly, and fairly that your target says, thanks, I wish I thought of putting it that way. So you must be able to see where the person or the view you're disagreeing with is coming from. You should be able to do that, right? And then two, you should be able to list points of agreement, especially if they are not matters of general or widespread agreement. Three is optional. If you learn something from your target, you should state it. And then four, that's the only time you are permitted to say so much as a word of rebuttal or criticism. Why is this guide important? There are at least two reasons. Why should you be interested in following it? First, this method of critical commentary will make your target listen to you because it shows them that you took the trouble of understanding their view. Now, if this is a student organization or this is a family situation or later when you work in an office, there's always going to be disagreement on what course of action to take. Now, when there's a proposal on the table that you would like to reject, and you are going to make a critical commentary on it, this is a good strategy. This is a good negotiation strategy because you show them you're listening, you show them you know where they're coming from, but you can still point out why we should not go with their proposal. So it's a sound strategy. It helps you to get other people to listen to you. At the same time, the way that you get other people to listen to you is by you listening to them as well, right? So I think this is the way in which moral deliberation or the kind of ethical deliberation we're learning can be helpful for troubleshooting or managing conflict resolution in the workplace. Sometimes actually people don't like to use the word ethics. Sometimes people call it troubleshooting because there are problems and there are issues, and what people want is to begin to at least build consensus. This guide to critical commentary is useful for that. Now, the other thing that's very important as you apply Dennett's guide is to abide by this principle. It's a very important principle. It's called the principle of charity. Principle of charity, which is valued very highly by atheist philosophers. So what is it? According to Simon Blackburn, the principle of charity is a methodological assumption made in order to understand a point of view different from our own, whereby we seek to understand the view in its strongest, most persuasive form before making a judgment about it. It's an attempt to think through an opposing view sympathetically. Now, here's the other thing about engaging in argument. You only use it as a target a view that is grounded on evidence. There is no point in arguing against a stupid view. That's actually a fallacy. It's called the straw man fallacy. It's a strategy where you argue a view that nobody holds because it's too foolish. So argument is actually only worthwhile if we have a worthy opponent, if there is a view worthy of consideration, that it is a view that could actually change our minds, right? So this is actually helping you develop stronger views when you argue against another perspective or a target with a strong or persuasive case behind it. So the principle of charity can be also characterized as listen to others or treat others' ideas as you would have them treat your ideas. right? So this second quote is from a book by Wayne C. Booth, where he says, intellectual understanding is one of the best versions of the golden rule. Listen to others as you would have others listen to you. Precise demonstration of truth is important, but not as important as a communal pursuit of it. Now, the idea here is that we should listen to other views and other opinions on morality, not just for the purpose of we're waiting for them to finish so we can already rebut, because we're already convinced that we're going to reject whatever it is that they're going to say. When we treat other people like that and they treat us like that, there can actually be no constructive conversation. And constructive conversation and constructive discussion is what we're aiming for. The argument, the methodology of argument is not about scoring points. It's not like using it in a debate competition. There is a place for debate competitions. That's not what we're interested in. We're not considering in scoring points as if you're in a contest or in some kind of political arena. What we're trying to get at is a better appreciation of what we think about right and wrong and what other people think about right and wrong, so we can have a better understanding or better decision on what we should do. Again, the point is action guidance and a better understanding of moral issues. Okay, at this point, I show you this tweet that I found about 2 weeks ago, I think, because I'm going to ask you to read a code of intellectual conduct that lays out in more precise details how to follow the principle of charity. So it's not a very long thing, but you are required to read it. And I read this text by Damer. It's a code of intellectual conduct for a book that he wrote. And the book is sometimes used in logic classes, but it actually helps us discuss controversial issues. So you're required to read that text and the Midgley text and the Mill text and other things that will be helpful for you to understand and apply rule utilitarianism. Okay, so that's it for this recording.